Now let's talk about the biodiversity of the Atlantic rainforest. First of all, the origins of this biodiversity. There's basically two sort of competing hypotheses regarding the current diversity that we see along the Atlantic forest and the distribution of this diversity. One of them is related to the idea of forest refuges. So during the glacial periods, during the periods where climate was colder than today, the forest would have contracted into refuges. So the species would be restricted to these refuge areas. And then with the warming of the interglacial period, then they would expand to the current distribution. So for the Atlantic forest, this paper by Carnevale and Moritz in 2008 proposes this large refuge to the north of the Doce River. So it's Espírito Santo in Bahia. It's called Bahia Refuge by the author. So this would be a large area where plants and animals would be would find refuge and then would be restricted there. There's also refuge up north, a couple refuges here down in the south. Not many refuges in the south, and so like mostly concentrated to the north. And then these contractions and separations of populations in different pockets of forest would allow speciation and diversification. Okay. An alternative idea was proposed by our group in 2016, which we call the Atlantis forest hypothesis, which instead of a contraction of ranges and population reduction during the glacial period, we observed both using genetic data and distribution modeling, we observed that actually for the species that we examined, we saw signs of expansion during the glacial period, which is sort of a paradox. So instead of refuge, we propose that the species ranges actually expanded during the glacial period. And during the glacial period, about 21,000 years ago, the continental shelf, which is now underwater along the beach, especially in southeast and southern Brazil, the continental shelf was exposed. So you had land here. And we proposed that this area, most of this area was covered with Atlantic forest. So the species, a different kind of Atlantic forest because the climate was colder than today, but still a forest. And then species would find and use this additional area, and this would allow the expansion of the population of some species. So that's a different view of this, and then most of the diversity would have been because of geological and other changes in the landscape, especially elevation changes and also weather changes, but way before the Pleistocene. When we study biogeography, we compare the distribution of different species of plants and animals. And then when we do that for Atlantic forest species, we find some patterns, which are very interesting. First of all, is that you have centers of endemism, so areas where species tend to occur there and only there together, right? So we have this Pernambuco endemism center, so which is in the northeastern part of the Atlantic forest. So you have mammals, birds, plants, insects that only occur there in this specific area. So that's called the Pernambuco center or the northeastern center. Then you have species that occur in the coastal area of Bahia and Espírito Santo here, and also some that occur in the central area of Bahia. That's a different set of species that occur either here or here. Then you have the Serra do Mar distribution, which are species that range from south of the Rio Doce all the way to the south here. And then you have the Paraná Araucaria center of endemism, which has species from the coast all the way to the inland. Okay, so that's kind of the southern component. So there's a southern component, a central component, and a northern component. So these components sort of are common features for many different species of plants and animals. So you have this in this area here near the Doce River mouth, you have this turnover. Okay, you have many species go from here to here, and then they don't go to the south here, and other species go from here to the south, and they don't go up north here. So the kind of fauna and flora that you have here is usually different from the kind of flora and fauna that you have here. That's also a climatic turning point. Okay, the climate here tends to be the climate here tends to be colder than the climate here usually, and you have colder winters here, especially. And here you don't have you usually don't have colder winters. The winters are cooler than the summers, but not very drastically different. Okay. These are some of the highlights in terms of plant diversity. So I'm calling attention to some of the plants that stand out in the Atlantic forest. One of them is the Jequitibá, which is this beautiful emergent tree, really tall, can reach up, almost 90 meters height. Cariniana legalis. There's more than one species of Jequitibá, but they're kind of the symbol of the forest, and most of them are gone because of for timber production. Okay, so that was most of them were cut for timber. Bromeliads are very typical, especially in the eastern and southeastern part of the Atlantic forest. Some areas you have a really high diversity, and they occupy. They can be epiphytes like this one. They live on top of another plant, of a tree trunk or tree. They can be terrestrial. They can also live on rocks. I mean, areas that are like the bare rock, almost a bare rock. You see some bromeliads there. So they're very, very interesting organisms, and they also serve as a mini ecosystem, because you have they collect water from the rain. And then you have these pockets of water where several species of insects and arachnids, and also even vertebrates like frogs, and they reproduce and they live here. Okay, so it's a kind of a microenvironment, and very, very unique and very interesting. Here you have one of the most famous trees, which is the Brazil wood, endangered, very endangered. That's you can see some red here. So the Brazil wood is really red, and it's been, gives the name to the country. So the name of Brazil comes from the Brazil wood, and the Brazil wood was one of the first timbers to be explored in the Atlantic forest. When the Portuguese colonized Brazil in the 1600s and 1700s. And was used widely used worldwide for many applications because of the beauty of the red color, and especially for musical instruments like violins. Those Stradivarius violins, they made of Brazil wood. Another tree here. This tree was described a few years ago as a new species, distinct from the Amazonian species. That's also a very interesting trend, where you have species in the Atlantic forest related to Amazonian species, but they diverged, because there used to be connections between the Atlantic forest and the Amazon, but it's been a long time that these connections don't. You have the formation of the Cerrado and Caatinga, this diagonal of open formations, and then the exchange between Atlantic forest and the Amazon has stopped for many, several 100,000 or million years. For many organisms, and this is one of them. The Juerana from the Amazon is a well-known plant, and this one was described as recently described as a new species the Joerana facão, Denise Joerana facão, from the Espírito Santo. And it's probably an endangered species because there are very few individuals left. It's, again, like the Jequitibá, an emergent tree, almost 90 meters high, beautiful, large trunk. Another one that stands out, that's a person here, so you can see the size of the tree. It's the fig tree, ficus. There's many species of ficus in the Atlantic forest, and they have this really nice, nicely shaped trunk, base, and the roots, and really wide, and they also stand out. And also the orchids. I mean, there are many species of orchids in the Atlantic forest. Some of them with very restricted distributions, very localized in very small patches. They have a commercial value for ornamental purposes, and so it's really important to protect the native orchids from this overexploitation that sometimes happens. But also a very diverse group, and usually, pollinated by insects very often, and very nice system of coevolution between insects and orchids. Well, when we look at the patterns of plant diversity, we have two kinds of plants here. Here, the epiphytes, so the plants that grow on top of other plants, that use other plants as a substrate. They don't touch the soil. There are many of them, including the orchids, are typical epiphytes, some bromeliads, not all of them, but some of them are. And then you see that the number of endemic species, endemic to the Atlantic forest, you see that for orchids, for bromeliads, more than 91% of them are endemic, okay? For orchids also, almost 80% of them are endemic, okay? The ferns are not, usually not many of them are endemic. But then, as you see here, the number of species of epiphytes is higher, especially here in Espírito Santo, where I am right now, especially because of bromeliads and orchids, and also, in the south here, and the southeast and the south. But you see here, I have a really high diversity of epiphytes. When you look at trees in general, you have a trend of a higher diversity in the south of Bahia, here in Espírito Santo, in Rio and São Paulo, in the Serra do Mar, especially here in Rio. There might be a bias here for number of people studying trees in those places, but anyway, this also has to do with the elevation gradient, because like in this area here, in the border between Rio, Minas Gerais, and São Paulo, you have two mountain ranges. You have the Serra da Mantiqueira inland and Serra do Mar along the coast. So you have two mountain ranges. You have a really steep gradient, and you have different species occupying the highest part of the mountain and the lowest part of the mountain. Here is the sampling priority. So where should we go to do inventories, to study the trees? Because as you see, for example, here you have a huge gap here in this region, right? So this is a priority for study. Also here along the dry forests here, you have a huge gap. To the west here also, right? So we need to go there and study and do more plant inventories there, because we don't know much about the tree diversity in those areas, as opposed to the coast here. And diversity in the Northeast tend to be smaller, okay? Because it's also, remember the size and diversity. The bigger the area, the more species you have. Animals. I have here some typical Atlantic forest animals. The woolly spider monkey, the muriqui, Bracteres arachnoides, is this one. This is the largest primates of all in the Americas. It's a very large sort of a spider monkey. Like spider monkeys are, typical spider monkeys are in the Amazon, with long arms and long legs and a prehensile tail. and this is the Atlantic forest representative. It's highly endangered, one of the top endangered primates in the world. This beautiful tanager, a 7-color tanager, also typical bird of the Atlantic forest, majestic. The Maine sloth, it's also endangered, only occurs here in the eastern part of the Atlantic forest. Has this color, this mane here, a black mane. It's a canopy species that it's a folivorous and very, very interesting animal, and you don't see them very often, but they're usually there at the top of the trees, eating some leaves. This is the golden lancehead. This snake is endemic to this island off the coast of São Paulo. Only occurs there. Very, very interesting animal, and the island is full of them. Famous for that. Perhaps the most famous animal, or one of the most famous conservation stories for the Atlantic forest and conservation in general, is the golden lion tamarin. There's 4 species of lion tamarins in Brazil, and occurring in different places. And golden lion tamarin is one of them. It's from the state of Rio de Janeiro, and it's protected especially in the Poço das Antas Biological Reservation. And in the 1980s, a conservation program started there. Took some animals to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. for reproduction. They reproduced the animals, and they started a program of reintroducing these captive born animals into nature. So there's a very strong project going on for more than 30 years for reintroducing the golden lion tamarin into the natural habitat, and also to study the ecology of the animal, and also promoting a forest connection and forest protection in this area where they live, a very restricted area. And so the conservation status of the golden lion tamarin has improved because of the conservation efforts taken. The blue manatee, the Chirochifia caudata, very interesting animal. You see them, males lining up on a stick and displaying and vocalizing and singing and dancing to attract females and competing among them like gymnasts, in Olympic Games, like trying to get the attention of the females. This is the snake-necked turtle, Hydromedusa maximiliani, found in streams and rivers in the Atlantic forest, also typical of the Atlantic forest turtle. The thin-spined porcupine, bristle-spined porcupine, it's a very distinct species of porcupine, also endangered, only has a very restricted distribution. It's a folivorous species of the Eastern Atlantic forest. Frogs, there are many different species of frogs, many of them endemic to very small areas. And this is one of them, was described very recently, the gold frog. It's really small, like less than 1 centimeter of length, and live in the forest floor. If we look at the patterns of diversity and endemism, this is for tetrapoda. Tetrapoda is basically vertebrates except for fish, so terrestrial vertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Okay, this is the number of species in the Atlantic forest, the total number of species and the number of endemic species. So you see the percentage of endemic species in the Atlantic forest is very high for amphibians, especially frogs. So 70% of them are endemic. Okay, and also when we compare to the number of amphibian species in the world, we see that almost 10% of the species of amphibians in the world are in the Atlantic forest, and 6.6% of them are endemic, are found only there, okay, of the whole world, right? Very high number here, okay? In terms of reptile, birds, and mammals, you have 20 to 30% almost of endemic species in the Atlantic forest. So for mammals, for instance, you have 6.7% of the mammals of the world are in the Atlantic forest, and almost 2% of them only there. Okay, 10% of the bird species of the world are in the Atlantic forest, and almost 2% of them only there. 5% of reptiles are in the Atlantic forest, of the world are in the Atlantic forest, and 1.3% of them are endemic. When we look at the spatial distribution of endemism, there's a very clear trend towards higher diversity and endemism along the mountains in the southeast Brazil. Okay, so the coastal range, Serra do Mar, and the Mantiqueira range, and so they all have this component. Okay, so you have a higher number of species and also of endemic species in this region compared to the other parts of the Atlantic forest. That's it.